I always think it's polite before I start to tell you a few things about myself. So, as John said, I'm Stephen Hart. I'm an actor and a YouTuber. I'm a radio presenter. I'm originally from Glasgow. That's where this weird accent comes from. I've lived in London for the last 20 years. I am adopted. I am diabetic, and I am also a survivor. I was first abused probably from the age of 3. I was so young that it kind of just seems to have always been there. And the abuse went on from the age of 3 to the age of 10. It was an uncle, obviously an adopted uncle, and he used to say to me, if you tell anybody, you'll get taken away. You'll go back to where you came from. And another threat was, don't tell anyone. Never tell anyone. And it's amazing as a survivor how that stays with you. And I didn't tell anybody. I continued on with my life, and the only way that the abuse stopped was at the age of 10, I ran away from home, and I continued to run away from home, but I never told anybody why. And eventually I was taken away, and my family was falling apart. My adopted mother had schizophrenia, and we were always brought up in a, secrets was something that was so interwoven in my family. You didn't talk about the fact that I was adopted. You didn't talk about the fact that my mother had schizophrenia. So you definitely didn't talk about what was going on, with my uncle. I spent a lot of time blaming myself, thinking, what had I done wrong? What was it about me that made my uncle do what he did? And I think any survivors in the room will recognise that, that thought of, what is it about me? Now, let's jump forward many years to 2016. It was obviously, 30 odd years later, and I went out with a friend one night for a drink in London, and it was a cold October night, and I was waiting for him in the bar, and when he arrived, he came in a bit flustered, and he was saying, I've just been arguing with my girlfriend on the phone, and then the phone rang again. So we were sitting in this bar, and he went in and out of this bar 3 times to talk to his girlfriend on the phone or to continue arguing with her. And on the 3rd time that he went outside, I decided to order another drink for us both. When he came back in, he said, Stephen, I cannot stay. He said, my girlfriend's literally moving out as we speak. He said, I've got to go. What are you going to do? And I was a bit miffed, to be honest, and I looked around at this bar and it was busy, and I looked at the clock on the wall in front of me and it said 10 o'clock. And I looked at the 2 drinks in front of me and I thought, I ain't wasting these. So I thought, I'm going to finish the drinks and then I'll go home. Now, what happened next is always kind of strange for me to talk about because there's so much of it that I don't remember. But there are some things that are still very clear to me. I suddenly felt very, very dizzy, and it was so quick that I was like, this can't be the alcohol. But I didn't know what it was. And I felt as if there was a heavy weight on the back of my head. So basically I was sitting on a bar stool, and all I was really able to do was look down at my boots. I remember 3 things. The first of those was seeing a guy's shoes standing in between mine. The second was the smell of cheap aftershave. And the 3rd was a guy's voice saying to me, do you need some fresh air, mate? I felt like I had closed my eyes for literally a split second, But I was woken by the sunlight shining through the window, and it was blinding me, and I was like, what is going on? Because I've been sitting in a bar on a cold October night at 10 p.m, but what I realised by looking at the clock next to my bed was that it was the next morning, it was 12 hours later. I felt sick, I felt shaky, I felt my head was fuzzy, I felt terrible, but I didn't know why, and I thought, I need to get up and get myself sorted. So I went to stand up, but as I went to stand, my legs completely gave way. I couldn't put any weight on them at all. So what I had to do was drag myself along my hallway to the bathroom, and by the time I got to the bathroom, by holding onto the towel rail and the door, I could just stand up. I turned on the shower. I thought, I'll have a shower, that'll make me feel better. I started to get undressed, kicked off my boots, undid my jeans, and as my jeans fell to the floor, I saw that they were covered in blood. I saw that my underwear was covered in blood, and the backs of my legs were covered in blood. And I just fell onto the floor saying, no, God, how can this have happened? If this would have happened, I would have remembered, and why can't I remember? And I should be able to remember. And it took me back to being that little boy, all those secrets that I'd kept hold of for all of those time, it all came back to me, and I just thought, no, this can't have happened again. Now, I'm a big fan of crime dramas and things, so, CSI, Miami, and all those things, I know what they say. I know they say don't wash away evidence. But I literally felt like somebody had opened a bottle of acid and poured it all over me, and that the skin was going to fall off my bones. I got into the shower, and it is like you see it in the movies. I scrubbed away my skin until it bled. After 45 minutes, I knew I had to do something. So I got myself out of the shower and called the hospital. The hospital called the police, and before I knew it, there was policemen and ambulance men in my house. They were collecting my clothes for evidence. They were dusting my house for prints. And I remember saying to the policeman, I think I've been raped. And he said to me, but you can't have been raped. You're a man. Now this was 2006, and I didn't call it rape for the next 2 years because somebody in authority had said to me, you can't be raped. Now I remember going to the hospital, and there was doctors and nurses, and everything was going on, and I kind of felt as if I was above it, looking down on it all. And I remember there was this really nice Irish nurse, thick Belfast accent, and she was holding my hand. And the doctor came in and he said to me, Stephen, from the blood work we've done, we can tell that you have Rohypnol in your blood. Now, Rohypnol was the date rape drug at the time. He also said, from the physical evidence, it looks like you've been sexually assaulted. I remember this nurse saying to me, Stephen, all your blood tests have come back clear for sexually transmitted infections, but you must come back within 3 months because it can take that long for the HIV virus to show in your body. So we just want to make sure you don't have HIV. Now I've got to be honest with you, I left that hospital and I had no intentions of ever going back. I left there and thought, what can I do to forget what I couldn't actually remember, if that makes any sense? So I went away, and I was never a drinker, I was never a drug taker, but I started because I was just looking for something to block out the memories and the memories that I was creating, of what happened while I was unconscious. After 6 months, I looked at myself in the mirror one day and thought, oh my goodness, you look awful. I was run down, I was tired, I hadn't been looking after myself. And all of a sudden, that nice Belfast nurse, her voice popped into my head again. And I remembered her saying, you need to come back. And I knew that I had to do something. I had to do something to start moving forward from what had happened to me. So I went back to the hospital. I went on my own because I wasn't worried. The worst that could possibly happen to me had happened. I remember the doctor coming into the room and she sat down with me and she said, "Stephen, I am so sorry, but the person that raped you was HIV positive, and you now too have HIV." The world kind of stops when you get news like that. And I thought back to my sex education at school, which was at 0. We had rabbits having sex with each other. That was the extent of it. And I thought back to what I knew about HIV/AIDS, and I thought of Freddie Mercury, I thought of Rock Hudson, I thought of all the people that had died, and that's what I thought was next for me. And I went away, and for the next 2 years, that's what I waited for. I just waited for death. And I actually used to go to bed at night and pray to God and say, "God, let my heart stop beating in the middle of the night, and let my flatmates find me in the morning and think that I died from a heart attack, because I don't want to live with HIV, and I sure as hell don't want to die from it." And, thinking back to what that policeman had said, rape doesn't happen to men. For those 2 years, those following 2 years where I was extremely depressed and extremely unhappy and very definitely suicidal, and I kept thinking, it doesn't happen to men, and that's all that kept going through my head, and I always say to people, I listened to far too much Whitney Houston and looked online for someone like me, and it was 16 years ago and I couldn't find anybody, and it's probably why I've got my own YouTube channel now, because I know how important it is to speak. Now, I remember waking up one morning, like 2 years later, and I'd been waiting patiently to die. I didn't feel brave enough to do it myself, and I was just hoping that it would happen naturally. And eventually I woke up and one morning just thought, I am so damn bored of waiting to die, because it doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon. So I've got to start living again. And that was a big thing, it's a big thing, isn't it, to start living again after we've been through what we've been through. And I didn't know what the first step was. I never had any counselling, never had any support, because I just didn't know where to go, and I was ashamed, and it was a secret, and all these things that I'd learned as being abused as a child stayed with me. And somebody online was talking about journaling, and I thought, that ain't for me. And then somebody was talking about writing your story, and I thought, maybe I should write my story for me. I never, ever imagined being on a stage, having lots of eyes looking at me, telling my story in public. It was never a plan. And I decided to start writing my story. My agent contacted me because I hadn't been around for work, and she said, "What are you doing at the moment?" And I said, "Oh, I'm kind of writing a book." And she said, "Oh, could I read a few chapters?" So I thought, yeah, okay. So I let her read some of it. She phoned me at 1:30 in the morning. When your agent phones you at 1:30 in the morning, you know something's not right. And she said to me, "Stephen, you need to do something with this." She said, "It's so powerful." She said, "It has to be heard." So my private story became my one-man show, Shadow Dreamer, which I took to New York in 2010. Now I went over there hoping I would maybe get a month over there, and you know, I felt lucky if I got a month, but my show was seen, in the first audience there was somebody from the Department of Education, and she saw it and she said, we need our kids to be educated on these things, you know, on all the things that I was talking about. And I got sponsorship from Brooklyn College, and they put my story on their syllabus. And I spent 9.5 months in New York, and my show closed off Broadway. Now, coming back to where we are now, and I think the realization from that was that I opened up an email account so that people could find out when my show was next on, where it was on, and all those kind of things. And I would get back to the apartment I was living in at night, and I would open my email account, and there were these stories. People were just telling me, they'd seen my story, and they were telling me their stories. And somebody said, Stephen, it feels like when somebody tells their story, it gives us a right to tell our stories. I think it was then that I realised the power a story can have, and how important all of our stories are. You know, you don't have to be up here like us on stage telling it, but our stories are important. Now, it takes a long time to get to a place where you can say, it wasn't my fault, I'm not to blame. It's taken, you know, I celebrated my 50th birthday in February, and it's taken more than half of my life to get to that point, and for it to happen again in my adult life, you know, it really rocked my world. And HIV and all those things, I really had the choice of sinking or swimming, and I thought I was going to sink for a long time, and I lost my childhood to sexual abuse, if that makes any sense. You know, I kind of grew up very, very quickly. I didn't want to grow up that fast, but I had to. But I think a couple of years ago I got to the point where I thought, I've lost enough of my life to sexual abuse and rape, and by telling my story, by sharing my story, I hope that it will be of use, whether it's in changing laws, whether it's in changing the ways that charities work with survivors, the language that's used is so important. And telling somebody that boys don't get raped, because that man was in a uniform and he was somebody of authority, I believe that, you know, but I know that that's not true. Now I'm gonna turn the microphone round and get you lot all to ask me questions now. And I have been asked every question under the sun, believe me, doing a show like mine for 9 months in New York, with a Q&A after every show. But it's so important to have these Q&As, because sometimes some of the best things that we can come up in conversations, in Q&As. So I'm gonna now pass it over to you guys, and please feel free to ask me anything. Thank you.
I'm Paul, I'm chair of First Light, but I want to ask you a question about another role that I have, which is as chair of a small theatre in Penzance. But I wonder if you tour the UK with your one-man show, and if so, would love you in Penzance.
So it was so strange with the UK, because and I love it. I'd always grown up watching things in New York on the television, so that was one of the reasons for New York. But another reason was it was far enough away from everybody that could have anything to do with my story, that they would never hear it, because again, even as a 36-year-old, I was still scared that I wouldn't be believed, or so I didn't. It was so strange. I didn't do it in the UK at all until 3 years ago, and it was just one day I was like, Stephen, the time has come. You've got to do it here. You have a right to do it here. There were so many people in the UK that, in London and in Glasgow, that had known me the majority of my life and didn't know my story. So I've done it in London a couple of times. I've done it in Scotland a couple of times now.
Southwest tour.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
There seems to be a recurring theme between the last two survivors' experiences that education is the problem. And I would just essentially like to suggest that maybe education is where we should start looking as a heart to the solution. Stop trying to treat the problem. Stop trying to treat the symptoms of the problem, and start trying to actually treat the problem, which is kids not knowing what's going on.
Yeah, I grew up in Section 28. So there was nothing. I just when I think back on it, there was so little. We need to start talking to kids about these things, and weaving it into the syllabus for kids here. When I went over to New York, they said, can you take out the rape out of your story? And at first I was just like, oh my goodness, somebody wants to sponsor me. But when I thought about it, I said no, because I said, if you don't have that, then you're missing out a chunk of my story, and I can't be genuine and I can't be honest, if that isn't included. And I also think that it's essential. These were college kids, these were kids from 16 to 21, and I said, it's essential, whether it's my drink was spiked, as I said, and I'd always thought, that doesn't happen to people like me. That's something you read about in the paper, happening to other people, So, yeah, I think education is a massive part of what we need to do.
One down here, Anna, I think.
Before sharing your story, just by listening to you, I just got this sense of, did you ever have like a battle or a struggle in your life with like this question of, why has this happened to me? Like you say, you see it in the papers, you see it in the news, but when it happens to you, but it happens to you twice in your life. So in that way, do you ever like battle with that, and how do you get out of that, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So I spent the majority of my 20s asking why. Why had I been brought into the family that I had? Why had I been given up by my birth family? Just why? And there just wasn't the answers, and then when it happened again, I kind of felt like I had this red light on top of my head going, I'm a victim, and I didn't want to be a victim. And that's why I do what I do now, because talking about it is my way of taking back the power, and in a way, not that I ever, can, take away from the wrong that those people did, but if I can take back, something from it and think that happened because I was meant to be standing here today, telling you my story and hopefully making a difference, then it was worth it.
From Operation Emotion, how did you start your story? how did you get started?
Just writing, Martin. It was completely by sitting down and starting from day one, from 1972. A little baby was adopted from an orphanage. It was literally like that, and I just worked, gradually through each year, and it was an amazingly healing thing, because when you see it down on paper, and I read it back, I cried, because it was real and it was in front of me, and I don't think we often give our own life stories enough credit, and I think that reading it and seeing it like that it was really powerful. But that's how I started. I just started from day one, and that was it.
Russell from Momentum. There's two things I just wanted to say. One is you talked about education and educating children, which I agree is important, but I think putting the onus on children to be protecting themselves against adults is kind of, we should be educating the adults as well, and people that are in education, dealing with children, to look out for signs of abuse, which I know is kind of, it's talked about, but it's kind of that, it's a societal problem as opposed to an individual child's problem. So it's how do we sort of make things better in society by making those that are protecting children more aware of that, but also allowing it to be talked about by you telling your story and allowing others to tell their story, and creating environments where it's okay to talk about. It doesn't have to be in like this closed environment like we are now. We can just make it something that's talked about out in the open. So, and there are different ideas. I won't bore you with about what we're thinking about doing that with. But so that's really the thing about educating. We need to educate society a bit more. And not make it the responsibility of children to look after themselves, but also giving them the tools to protect themselves at the same time.
Yeah, I think it's just making them aware. I go into schools and talk. I'm with a charity called Terrence Higgins Trust, who are the biggest HIV charity in the UK, and I go into schools and talk about living with HIV. But I also talk about the fact that I was raped, because, and this is from kids from the age of 13 upwards, not because, I want to put all the onus on them, but just because we want to make them aware. But as you say, we're not only educating the kids, we're also hopefully educating the teachers and anybody else that might be listening. So yeah, it's trying to get that across to everybody, really. Any more?
Jeanette from More Positive Me. I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's spoken today. Really found it really helpful. I just wanted to ask how the HIV is for you now. What's the number?
It's crazy, because HIV was the first thing I thought of every morning when I woke up, and the last thing that I thought about every night when I went to sleep for 2 years, without a doubt. And now I hardly think about it. It's so well controlled. The virus is undetectable in my body because of the medication. I can't pass the virus on. I also have diabetes, and my diabetes is a lot more of a pain in the ass than HIV is, which seems insane for me to because I was so scared and so I thought that HIV was going to kill me, but not today.
Hi Stephen, my name is Paul. I'm part of the Trauma Informed Plymouth Network Lived Experience Group. I just want to ask you you said about your lost childhood, if you can just sort of give people an understanding of what that was like.
I think when you experienced sexual assault as a child, for me anyway, it just took away my innocence, you know, it took away the laughter of a child, the you know, just the learning, all those different things that I think you do gradually as a child. I felt as if it was stripped away from me. I felt as if I was now dealing with an adult problem, if that makes sense. You know, I was dealing with something that I knew was out of, you know, I knew it was something that I shouldn't be dealing with, but at the same time, there was nobody, you know, nobody to speak to, and because of that, I grew up far too young, and I often look at myself, you know, at the age of 50 and still being a big kid at heart, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that I wasn't able to be a kid because I would never bring anybody to my house because of all the secrets that we had. So I never had friends when I was young, you know, that would come, you know, for sleepovers or things like that. And I think I missed out on a lot of the normal kid things, you know, and yeah, I just felt I had to start taking responsibility for things far too soon, you know, and I think that's what sexual abuse of a child can do, you know, it just takes away the innocence. And I mean that as the child's, you know, inquisitiveness of the child, all those kind of things. I felt as if I lost all of those things. Anybody else?